values society. So let's give a warm MSU welcome to author and professor Phil Howard.
Thanks, Rich, for that great introduction. And I also want to thank Colleen Matz, who's just outside the door right now, and everyone else at the Center for Regional Food Systems, who did an amazing job organizing this event. And I want to thank all of you for making it out late on a Thursday afternoon. It's great to see so many people who are interested in these issues. So I want to leave lots of time for questions, comments, informal discussions. So I realized that my original plan, I'm not going to be able to just stand here and read the entire book to you. I can't talk that fast, so I'm going to have to focus. And the book looks at a number of different stages in the food system and identifies the most powerful firms, and it looks at some of the strategies those firms are using to try and increase their power. So I'm going to focus just on part of one chapter, which is the packaged food and beverages industry. And I'm going to talk about strategies of spatial colonization that they are using to increase their power. So how do I identify the most powerful firms? Well, I use market share. There's been a tendency in a lot of food industries to move away from competitive markets characterized by a lot of small firms to markets that are dominated by a few very large firms. And institutional economists have a general rule of thumb that when 4 firms account for 40% of sales, that market is no longer competitive, and that those large firms have a lot of power to set prices. And they also have a power in a lot of other areas of society, which I'll get to. So just how concentrated is the food industry? The top 10 firms, as of 2011, accounted for...
Are you recording?
It
look like it's recording. Yeah, you are?
It is recording.
All right, great, thanks.
Yeah, as of 2011, the top 10 firms accounted for 32% of all food and beverage sales in the U.S. So that's not 4 firms controlling 40% of sales, but keep in mind that's for all foods and beverages. And if you look at any specific food and beverages, it's likely to be much higher, the share of the top firms. So for example, if you go to the back of your supermarket and you look at the margarine brands, you'll probably see all of these and probably all of these. But unless you look very carefully at the packaging, what you won't see is that those are owned by just 2 firms. And that those 2 firms control 68% of sales in the U.S. So the executives in these firms, what they're always trying to do is become more powerful than other big firms. And the reason they do that is because if they don't, they're going to lose their shareholders, or they're going to be vulnerable to being bought out by bigger firms. So the challenge in the food industry compared to, say, cell phones is the size of our stomachs is limited. There's only so much we can eat or drink. So food companies have to be very innovative in trying to beat other big firms in the rest of the economy. And so some of that involves steering our purchases into new directions, or simply buying out other firms and increasing their market share that way. And firms use both these strategies. For example, this is from a very fascinating article that came out a month ago, Beyond Spam, Bloomberg News. And you can see that Hormel is doing much better than their closest competitors in the food industry. And some of that is because they've bought out organic meat companies, organic peanut butter companies, and they've also employed a corporate anthropologist to help them figure out how to change consumer behavior and increase their sales. So spatial colonization is a term used by Tony Winson, the author of The Industrial Diet. And there are a lot of different ways that firms can spatial colonize. So one obvious is to enter markets they haven't been in before. What you see here is Nestle's floating store, which goes up and down the Amazon River in Brazil to sell their processed foods to people who wouldn't have access to it otherwise. You can see this on campus. It's pretty easy to access some of these processed foods and beverages through vending machines. You don't have to go very far, and in some places, they're expanding all the time. Convenience stores, you also don't have to go very far on this campus to find a convenience store. And there's some other battlegrounds like shelf space. even though shelf space expands as supermarkets seem to get bigger and bigger, it's still limited. So dominant firms are constantly trying to increase the amount of shelf space they have relative to other competitors. And business analyst Steve Hannaford also talks about mind space. You might not think about mind as a space, but that's being colonized by big corporations. This is American Alphabet by the artist Heidi Cody. And if you look at all those letters, which are parts of logos, you can probably recognize almost all of them. And most of them are for packaged foods and beverages. So firms are spending lots of money to constantly reinforce their brand image and reinforce our loyalty to those brands. And in fact, the Coca-Cola, which has been very effective at this, their brand image is estimated to be worth about $90 billion. So I'm going to talk about just 3 specific foods and beverages and how spatial colonization plays out for these. So I'm going to talk about beer, bagged salad, and soy milk. So let's start with beer. In the US, beer sales are about $200 billion a year. And here are the dominant firms. The top 2 firms, AB InBev and Miller Coors, control roughly 70% of the market. And that's actually a decline from just a few years ago, which I'll talk about. But they became very big using some of these strategies. And one is, mind space, advertising. Anheuser-Busch is a firm that until recently made very few acquisitions. They increased their market share in the 80s and 90s through very effective advertising. This is a Super Bowl ad you may have seen. Budweiser frogs, the What's Up guys, on and on. Very memorable ad campaigns that have helped them increase their sales. And some of their advertising is even more subtle. You may know about product placement in movies. A few years ago, it's reported that Anheuser-Busch spent $23.5 million just for a few seconds of screen time in Man of Steel so that Clark Kent could drink a Budweiser. And Pabst Blue Ribbon, also interesting how valuable the brand image is, because Pabst and the 20 other brands that they control are not actually brewed by that firm. It's all contracted out to SAB Miller. But in 2010, Metropoulos and Company bought Pabst for $250 million, and then 4 years later sold it for $750 million. And they still don't brew any beer. And then for shelf space, this is another really key battleground that the big firms have been very effective at controlling. Most retailers designate that their largest supplier is a category captain. And that captain has the power to designate the space and all the placement of the beer on the shelves. And they use very sophisticated software. They're called planograms. If you've seen the movie Beer Wars, you might have seen this before, but not many people would otherwise know about it. And it's very sophisticated in that they use a lot of data to design these planograms, such as census data from the surrounding area, daily sales data, just how much shelf space is available. And there's a lot of concern among craft brewers and some other smaller competitors that when the category captain has full power to design this, that they're going to get less shelf space. And the craft brewers have found, the Brewers Association, which is made up of mostly craft brewers, found that in these different retail categories, a huge percentage, or most of them, is controlled by AB InBev, and most of the rest is actually controlled by SAB Miller. So, they have stated that from their analysis, it's likely that not only the craft brewers, but the retailers are losing money because more space is allocated to the bigger firms. So the way they are able to take up so much space, in addition to just having that power, is they have a lot of brands and varieties. So this is a graphic that Ginger Ogilvy over there helped me with. This is some of the top dozen brands and varieties of beer firms. And I'm going to zoom in on Anheuser-Busch so you can see just how many they have, particularly for Budweiser and Michelob, many, many varieties there. And then Miller Coors also has 24 different brands. Not quite as many varieties, but still a very large number. And more specifically, one of the things they do is take existing brands and put out a huge number of variations on it. So, for example, Bud Light. It would take you a long time to list the number of varieties of Bud Light that have been around the last few years. Here's some of their fruit-flavored ones. And since we're in Michigan, I have to point out that cherry is one that is available. It's not on this picture. So they're not changing their brewing style. They're just adding very inexpensive flavors, or they're having, you know, Bud Light Platinum, Bud Light Dry, Bud Light Ice, things like that. So this is the way they can put a lot of varieties and take up a lot more shelf space. And they also have what are called crafty varieties. So these look and are priced like craft beers, but they're actually brewed by these big brewers. And so here's a couple from AB InBev and Miller Coors. And you know, they're shelved right next to the other craft brews, and many people don't even know that these are owned by the big brewers. And then because they've been losing sales in the US and some other very industrialized countries at the expense of craft brew, which is exploding, more than 15% of sales in the US now, they've just in the last few years really started buying up craft breweries. Before the last couple of years, AB InBev bought Goose Island out of Chicago, and then they bought Blue Point in New York. But just in the last 2 years, these are the other acquisitions those two big firms have made. And because that hasn't been effective in the US in recent years, it was very effective before that, they're now looking globally. So those two big firms I mentioned, they're both headquartered in Northern Europe, as with the other two of the top 4 beer firms. So in the last 15 years, the two biggest beer firms in the US were acquired by European firms who are expanding globally. And they're now focusing much more on markets like China and Africa and South America. And another thing they're doing is, even that's not enough. So you probably have heard that AB InBev is now going to acquire the second largest beer firm in the world, SAB Miller. So in the US, they're going to hand off all those Miller brands to their joint venture partner, Molson Coors. So we're still going to have 2 companies in the US, but in other parts of the world, it's a near monopoly. Places like South Africa, well over 80% of beer sales are from this one firm. So the next product I want to talk about is bag salad. The impacts. I want to just briefly mention the impacts. After InBev acquired Anheuser-Busch, they twice raised prices, and those were immediately matched by SAB Miller. And this is according to the Department of Justice in the US. So we have definitely seen higher beer prices as a result of this consolidation. And the price of beer has increased much more rapidly than other alcoholic beverages like spirits and wine. So for bag salad, here the market is roughly $4 billion a year in the US. And this is a category that didn't even exist in the mid-'80s. So right now, the top firms are Chiquita, Fresh Express, Dole, Earthbound, and ReadyPack. And although Earthbound share looks fairly small there, for the much smaller category of organic bag salad, they actually control 55% of the market. And Earthbound is really the one that developed this category. This is Drew and Myra Goodman, who founded. They started with an organic farm. They lost one of their restaurant customers and had a bunch of lettuce they didn't know what to do with. And because they were busy in the fields all day, they had bagged their own lettuce to just dump out at dinner. And so they had the idea to just start selling that at retailers. And it was really successful, and they got bigger and bigger. But the challenge was getting into mainstream supermarkets. And they were able to get into food co-ops in the Bay Area, natural food stores. But to get into mainstream retailers, there's something you have to deal with called slotting fees. So not much is known about this because it's very secretive, but it's estimated that about $9 billion a year is spent paying retailers money just to get on those shelves. And even for like a single product in a regional supermarket chain, it's estimated to cost tens of thousands of dollars. So if you're a small firm, you may not have tens of thousands of dollars just to get your product on the shelves. So they got some venture capital and so on. But that got them the shelf space to grow that category. It was copied by conventional growers like you saw on the previous slide. But they're continually expanding the shelf space allocated to those bag salads. So for example, offering many different sizes, offering salads with more ingredients. They're even marketing salads to kids with Disney themes. So those have been pretty effective in this industry. But there have been some negative impacts. So we have all this increased production of leafy greens. Almost all of it is occurring in deserts in California, Arizona, and Mexico. And you may have heard there's drought in California. So water is a real issue. And probably more concern for people in this region is the outbreaks of disease that have been linked to these bag salad products. So here was one of the most dramatic, the 2006 outbreak of E. coli in spinach, which affected 26 different states. It turns out more than 40 different brands were being packaged in the same processing facility. And many other disease-causing organisms have been linked to bag salads. So what's interesting is if you talk to some of the growers, they won't even eat the bag salads that they're selling to these companies. And then soy milk. Soy milk sales in the US are about $1 billion a year, but that's declining a little bit as they lose ground to other milk alternatives like almond and coconut milk. But this is really dominated by White Wave, which has the brand Silk and So Delicious, over 75% of the market. And then their next closest competitor is 8th Continent with over 5% of sales. So Silk is a brand of White Wave. White Wave was founded by Steve Demos. And since the 70s, he was very idealistic in trying to increase consumption of soy products. And he wasn't really very successful with his soy ice cream and all kinds of different soy products until the mid-90s. And that's when he had the idea to take soy milk and take it off the shelf-stable aseptic packaging and put it in the refrigerator case right next to dairy milk. And so that made it much more visible to more mainstream consumers, people who don't shop at natural food stores. And it really took off. But to do that, he had to get into those mainstream retailers. And he needed to pay those slotting fees as well. So one of the things he did is he started approaching big companies like Kraft to see if they'd be willing to partner with him and get into the stores. And one company that was willing to work with him, after a number of them turned him down, was Dean Foods. So Dean Foods, within a few decades, had acquired more than 60 different dairy firms, and they still use more than 30 of these regional brands. So after consolidating the conventional dairy industry, then they started investing in organic milk and milk alternatives. So they took a stake in Steve Demos' company White Wave and eventually acquired all of it and forced Demos out. And in the last few years, this is Greg Engels, the CEO of Dean, who came under a lot of pressure because he had really huge compensation packages. He was getting paid a lot of money to run Dean Foods, and the stock performance was terrible. So the investors were threatening to revolt. So what he did was he took those organic and natural brands that they'd acquired over the years and spun them off as a separate publicly traded company. He became the CEO of that company. And that gamble paid off. So he continued to make more acquisitions. That's what he does, is buy up other companies. So after buying all these companies and spinning off, they bought So Delicious, another competing soy milk. And then if you have sharp eyes, you can see they bought Earthbound Farm, the organic bag salad company. So expanding into new categories of organic and natural foods. And it was just announced a few months ago that this publicly traded company is going to be acquired, if the regulators approve, by Danone, a French yogurt company, for $12.5 billion. That's more than 8 times the market cap of the Dean Foods, the conventional dairy business. So Greg Engels knew which way to jump when the going got tough. So there's a lot of concern that if Danone does go through with this, that all of these organic yogurts and alternative milks are going to be priced much higher than they are now. So these trends don't go unopposed. There's always resistance to some of these efforts. So these protesters were successful in overturning prohibition in the 30s, but they weren't successful in that home brewing was outlawed in the US for nearly 50 years. It wasn't until 1979 that people could legally brew their own beer. So by that time, there were less than 50 breweries in the entire US, all putting out basically the same product, pale lager. So things changed pretty dramatically when home brewing was legalized, even though in Mississippi and Alabama, it wasn't until 2013 that it was legalized. But there was a lot more interest in trying different styles of beer. And so many of those home brewers went on to start craft breweries. So in the US, we're now approaching 5,000 craft breweries. We now have more breweries than we had before Prohibition. There are another estimated 2,000 in development. And just here in Michigan, you can see per capita, Michigan does pretty well compared to other states. We now have more than 200 breweries. Bag salad is very expensive, so some people are willing to pay for the convenience of it, to pay more. But people who want to save money or are concerned about the potential disease risks, it's not that hard to buy a full head of lettuce, wash it, and prepare it yourself. So we see that happening. And another, in terms of cost savings, people are realizing that soy milk, if you have a blender and a strainer, you can make it at home. And there are also more and more appliances like this that make the process a little more automated. So, and it's not just do-it-yourself movements that are countering these spatial colonization strategies. Particularly if you look at other foods and beverages, there are organized efforts to, for example, remove vending machines from public schools, to limit the portion size at restaurants, to add additional taxes on some of these foods. So some of these strategies are, which have been very successful in recent decades, are starting to encounter some more limits. So to recap, I just talked about spatial colonization strategies that the dominant firms use in beer, bag salad, and soy milk. And I want to end with a couple of questions. What would it look like if we became more aware of these and other strategies that the dominant firms use to increase their power? And what can we do? What more can we do to resist these trends? Thanks. Any questions, comments?